And welcome to Shoals Marine Laboratory's weekly seminar series. I'm Dr. Jennifer Seavey, the Executive Director of Shoals. And for those of you who are not familiar with us, Shoals is the largest and the oldest undergraduate focused marine lab in the country. And it's an institution of both Cornell University and the University of New Hampshire. We are located on Appledore Island in the Isles of Shoals, which is an archipelago of islands about 10 miles offshore of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And we have offices at the University of New Hampshire and at Cornell as well. This series, which runs through the end of this year, is designed to bring the Shoals Marine Lab community together to learn and discuss and hopefully develop new ideas for marine science and interdisciplinary intersections such as this art talk tonight. Our format tonight is a 45-minute talk followed by 15 minutes of questions and answers. We welcome your questions, and if you want to ask some, use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you click there, you can type in your question and I'll read them out loud to John Coffey, our speaker, at the end of his talk. If you have any technical problems or questions, you can also use that box to ask those and we will address them. So I'm really excited to have John Coffey with us tonight. He is the Deputy Director and Curator of American and Modern Art at the North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh, North Carolina, a position that he has held for 32 years. Prior to that, he served for 8 years as the Curator of Collections at Bowdoin College's Art Museum. He has organized numerous exhibitions and authored many publications on the topics in American art. And exciting for us and the intersection with Shoals and he is that beginning in 2011, he led an interdisciplinary team to research the American Impressionistic painter Childe Hassam, who spent 30 years in the Isles of Shoals in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that's what he's going to be talking to you about tonight. This team was hosted by Shoals Marine Lab under the leadership of John, and these team members met every summer on Appledore to identify and document all of Childe Hassam's painting sites on the island. And the result was the American Impressionist Childe Hassam in the Isles of Shoals exhibit, which opened in 2016 at the North Carolina Museum of Art, and then it traveled up to the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. John has his undergraduate degree from North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he has a master's in art from Williams College. So tonight he's going to be talking about where Fred became Childe Hassam and Celia Thaxter on the Isles of Shoals. So welcome, John. We're really excited to have you with us this evening. You can start your video and unmute and you can take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jen. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to go back after 4 years to the Isles of Shoals, at least in my mind, and also, excuse me, getting ahead of myself. And also it's my maiden voyage with Zoom lecturing, which comes at the tail end of my career. I'm just amazed it has happened. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to make a fool of myself. But the topic I wanted to address really is the relationship of an extremely remarkable woman, Celia Thaxter, with an equally remarkable man, Childe Hassam, and the cultural milieu that was out on Appledore at the latter decades of the 19th century up to Celia's death in 1894, and then Hassam continues on until 1916, and to explore, what the Isles of Shoals meant to this artist. He really came to see the island through Celia's eyes. Um, and I might as well just go on and explain the title as it is, because he was born, Childe Hassam was born in Boston, and his name was Frederick Childe Hassam, and he often signed his letters just Fred Hassam. Hassam is not a terribly exotic name, it's just a corruption of the Yankee Howsam. But Celia, who was quite romantic minded, when she came to know Hassam in Boston before he ever came out to the Isles of Shoals, she really convinced him that being known as Frederick Childe Hassam or F. Childe Hassam was not sufficiently artistic enough. And so she convinced him to drop the F, the Frederick, from his name, so that he could really revel in the associations with Lord Byron and Childe Hassam and God, I've forgotten. Anyway, Childe Harold. So she really did rechristen him at the very start of his career. And I think it made quite a difference, certainly in his marketing. But far more important is Hassam's, his artistic development, evolution that took place out on the Isles of Shoals. And a little bit of sort of a preamble, just talking about Appledore. As Jen points out, it noted that Appledore is the largest of a small archipelago of islands off the coast of Maine and New Hampshire. And it has a long and storied history, fishing and being competed over by the French and the British and the Spanish and whatever. But it is most celebrated now in the 19th century, when it became the locus of a very, an extraordinary resort, quite surprising resort, which became the model for upper class leisure in the United States in the middle part of the 19th century. It was, when you go out to the island now and you look out over Babb's Cove and the rocks, and then the buildings that are mostly 20th century, it is hard to imagine that this is what was there 100 and some years ago. The Appledore house and related cottages, it was a spectacular summer resort. At its height, which was in the 1870s and 80s, the dining room could hold 500 guests. The whole island, which was only 94 acres, was crawling with tourists. There were plank road paths that circumnavigated the island, that were laid up by the hotel owners. The owners were the Leighton family, Thomas Leighton, and eventually his 3 children who came to run it. Leighton had been the lighthouse keeper on White Island, and he was the one who really had the amazing entrepreneurial idea of converting these very rocky, sort of failing fishing islands into a high-class resort. And the beginnings of the Appledore house were 1848, and it grew over the decades into what you see in this image from the turn of the 20th century. It's good to point out when we're going to be talking about Celia Thaxter, if this is her cottage, which is just to the left of the main complex of the hotel that straddles the primary swale that crosses the island. And it's also good to point out when we start looking at Hassam's paintings, and particularly when next week when Hal Weeks takes you on a tour of some of the rockier, wilder areas of the island, is to note that one, it is a very small rock, 94 acres. In the 19th century, it was far more barren than it is now. The vegetation was kept down by grazing animals, sheep and cows. And it was crowded with people in the summertime. There were swimming holes in the front. People arrived almost every day. They were often marched up to the hotel with a German band playing. There was tennis. Kids were everywhere, and it's worth remembering that when you were looking at the paintings that the artist chose to make or made on Appledore. Very, very few references to the almost chaotic recreational aspects of Appledore show up in these paintings. Hassam seems to go out of his way to avoid showing people in most cases, and his idea is to transform Appledore into a kind of primordial wilderness island. And it took a fair amount of doing, because when you look at this place, and Celia and her famous garden, it's often presented that the garden is almost by itself, or the house is by itself, but it is actually right in the dead center of this extremely lively summer resort. And just some postcards that show that. What was amazing to me in my trips out to Appledore is just trying to imagine this place. You can still see the rock and the brick foundations of some of the buildings, but it is just, to me, impossible to imagine the full extent of what this complex was like in its heyday. And when we were doing this exhibition, we created a map over here that show all the houses and the buildings of the hotel as they were in the time of Celia Thaxter's day. And her house is right here. And most of the paintings that I am going to be showing today are done by Hassam, are done in this area. He did the first part of his experience on Appledore. He was very much focused on Celia's house, garden, the hotel itself, and there's very little of his artistic production that portrays any other part of the island until Celia's death, until there's that separation and he starts venturing off on his own. Now, Celia's house was something of a replica of her parents' house that was on the other side of the swale and actually still exists as part of the Shoals lab complex. But it had, it was a sort of classic New England cottage with a very large, long piazza, as they call the porch. It was extended in the 1870s with the extension of her parlor. As her artistic salon became more and more popular, she needed more space. So she extended the parlor and then a wraparound part of the piazza as well. And then she also extended the garden at the same time. Now this garden still, I mean, as you see it here, this is from about the time of her, close to the time of her death, it's a small garden. It's 50 by 15 feet. It was a cutting garden. you know, for a garden that is arguably the most famous garden in the United States in the 19th century, it's dinky. It's really quite a surprise when you go to see it the first time. And it's also worth noting, I mean, like in this photo, in this photo, it shows the house in isolation. You don't get a sense of it as very much a part of a much, you know, bustling resort community. And looking out the garden gate, you can see across the bay to other houses and then the hotel on the left. So when you're thinking of the garden, it's not in isolation. There are tennis balls being whacked very close by. There are kids running all over the place. There's a German band. There are people splashing in the water. You know, it's a different kind of an atmosphere than you are led to believe when you look at the paintings of Childe Hassam that he does in the garden. Now, Celia was the eldest of 3 children born to Thomas Layton, the lighthouse keeper, and then the hotel entrepreneur. It was a remarkable family, a remarkable story of that. At a very, very early age, she was moved out to the lighthouse with her family, and they lived there on this postage stamp of a rock for quite a few years until they moved first to Smutty Nose Island and then to Appledore to begin the career in the hotel industry. The children, Cedric and Oscar and Celia, really never were comfortable on the mainland. Celia more than the others, but they really were island folk, and the islands, Appledore in particular, but the Isles of Shoals in general, you know, were their world. And for Celia, when she left to go to school in Boston, and then she married and lived for a while in Boston, she was always coming back to the islands, and eventually she came back at least, you know, part of each year to help her brothers and her mother run the hotel after her father's death. She became the hostess of the island, of the hotel. She was also kind of the rainmaker in that she had already established quite a strong literary career in Boston through her poetry, through her journalism, some of her books, and you know, she was a known quantity in the New England literary scene, and she coaxed many of her friends and associates to come out to Appledore, and that sort of elevated the tone of the place, which was important. It built up a reputation, and so people like Longfellow were out there, and Harriet Beecher Stowe came out there, and well, Nathaniel Hawthorne very early on came out when Celia was still a teenager, and she captivated him so much. She referred to him as the Miranda of the islands, which he of course loved, that reference to the sort of wild child in Shakespeare's The Tempest. And so Celia's her literary reputation was a great asset to the family business at the Appledore house. And part of what she did out there was not just manage a lot of the bookings and housekeepers and such in the hotel, but she also began developing a very informal salon that was somewhat patterned after the literary salons that she had attended in Boston. And she would all of her friends who would come out there would gather in her parlor, and there would be musicians, there would be writers, poets, novelists, journalists, and there would be artists. Because Celia, among her many other talents, was very interested in the visual arts. She took lessons in Boston, beginning in the late 1860s and 70s. And through that, she met a whole group of mostly younger artists in the Boston area, and she coaxed them to come up. And they added to the mix. And the wildness of Appledore, being, stuck out there in the Atlantic with this first-class resort hotel where you could get a good glass of scotch at the end of the day, and you could talk and have great conversations. You could perambulate very long boardwalk. You could see and be seen there. And then you could also rub elbows with the famous Celia Thaxter and her friends. And if you were lucky, you could be invited up on the piazza or into the parlor for soirees and musicales. Celia also was a very gifted china painter. And this is an example of one of her pieces. She would do these to make money, because she was always needing money. Her husband was not a great provider by any means. So she basically supported the family, her three kids, and also she also supported the hotel when it needed it. She was constantly monetizing her art in one way or another. She's really one of the most intrepid individuals that the century produced, certainly in New England. And her soirees were, they were very informal, but she really kept them going with the force of her personality. This photograph is just a gathering on the porch from 1886, and Celia is on the right. She's facing out at us. The man with his back to us on the right is Childe Hassam. This is 1886 is the first year that Hassam and his wife had an extended stay out on Appledore. And so it really marks the beginning of his very long-term love affair with the island. He was out there earlier in, as part of our research, we turned up an early wood engraving after a watercolor that he made probably in 1882, in which he is already starting to fudge a little bit with proportions here. This is Neptune's Hall, which is now called Broadway and 42nd Street. And as you can see by the diminutive figures in the lower left, Hassam is trying to make this trap dike into something of a canyon, a deep and forbidding canyon, when it actually it isn't. But that is something that I think Hal will talk about next week, is how Hassam used the relatively small but rugged features of Appledore. He turned them into something quite monumental, just depending upon the perspective of the artist, how he would position his canvas looking up at a certain angle and so on. But getting back to Hassam, these are early photos of him. The one on the right is he's on Celia's porch. He seems to have painted quite a few pictures from Celia's porch or from the upstairs windows of her cottage, but he seems to have used her cottage maybe as a way to get away from the hubbub of the hotel, and she allowed him a certain refuge and quiet to do his painting. Hassam produced one of his finest pictures on the right is of the parlor in Thaxter's cottage, done a little about the same time as the photo on the left, and it shows Celia's extreme Victorian taste of paintings and photographs and etchings hung right to the ceiling, of piles of books, and then also because that was what she was known for more than anything. That, as I mentioned, the flower garden that she had was a cutting garden. It was to furnish flowers for the vases that proliferated in her parlor and scented the room. And this is where many of the very sophisticated literary and artistic events happened. Hassam evokes that gorgeousness of color in this painting called The Room of Flowers. He also painted Celia in her garden. She seems not been too shy with of a camera. There are lots of photographs of her, but then she was the celebrity of the island. And she was always puttering out in the garden. If you've read her book, An Island Garden, she's happiest when she is out there tending the garden and talking to people over the fence about flowers and such. Her garden, just this plan that she provided in her book, An Island Garden, which is not a completely accurate depiction of the garden as it really was, but it does show you the plethora of flowers that she planted, and she would change them in succession in order to have the garden blooming the whole of the hotel season. These are just photos of the recreation of the garden, which gives you an idea of what it was like. What is amazing to me about that garden is in the context of Appledore and the Isles in general provide a very sort of severe, beautiful environment, but it's very severe. And then you have this one patch of riotous color that is not found anywhere else. And that is what made it probably even more astonishing to people, more memorable, was that the spare context of this extravagance, this little bit of extravagance on these islands, probably added to the celebrity of the island. Then Hassam, beginning in the late 1880s, he starts to paint the garden, which is what an Impressionist painter does. I mean, Hassam had been to France by this time, spent a fair amount of time in France, had come back. He knew Monet, he knew all of the Impressionists, certainly knew their work well. And Celia's garden provided him with the perfect model for what to do. The flowers, the delicacy of the flowers, the brilliancy of the color, the movement of the island breezes. He was trying to capture all of that in paint. And this is, I think, his greatest painting that he did on Appledore. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I think it really does capture so much of what Celia was about. She wasn't into the formality of the garden. She was into the color and the sort of exuberance of light, and because you look at Hassam's painting and you can feel that sort of slightly chill marine air, as well as the sun coming through the petals and making those poppies really pop out. Now, if you look at the details, as I've always loved getting really close to an Impressionist picture and then seeing how he managed to communicate the freshness of his vision, not bothering, not slowing down to get every detail of a petal exactly right, but get the color in movement, and develop a variety of different brushstrokes that together will communicate the vitality of the space. And he did that with a number of other, a series of these paintings where he set his easel either, Hal and I had discussions about this because, you know, the position of Bab's rock out there is such a dominant element in so many of Hassam's pictures from this period. But it seems like he painted the flowers and then he painted Bab's rock, and he would and he would collapse the space between the two. And in some cases, he's not painting in the garden, he's painting outside where Celia planted banks and banks of poppies that sort of cascaded down the slope towards the shore. And some of these pictures may have been painted outside of the fenced-in garden and looking through some of those banks of poppies. But there's some of the great glories of American Impressionism, just these paintings here. You get the feeling that Hassam, who by this time had moved to New York and was starting a very high-pressured artistic career in New York. When he comes out to the Isles of Shoals, he's partly on a busman's holiday, and there's a great deal more freedom and I would say joy in these pictures that you find then in his other pictures that he does, where he's perhaps a little more under the critical gaze of the New York art scene. In the early 1890s, Celia was approached to do a book about her garden because it had become so celebrated by that time. And so she collaborated with Hassam on the book. It really is a joint collaboration, her words and his images. And he produced quite a few paintings, mostly watercolors, to illustrate this book. The watercolors were then transferred into chromolithographs. But, excuse me. These are some of the original watercolors that found their way, reproduced in an island garden. And that book is what probably cemented the Isles of Shoals in the popular imagination. Celia, back in 1873, had written a wonderful book called Among the Isles of Shoals, which was a recounting of a lot of the Shoals lore going back to colonial days and so on. And that had definitely increased the guest traffic at the hotel. You know, people really, it put Appledore on the map, but an island garden was in a class by itself, and it really did create a mythology about the Isles of Shoals, in which, you know, I'm sure people thought that the whole of the island was full of hollyhocks and asters instead of limited to just this one garden. But it really did become one of the runaway bestsellers among garden literature in the late 19th century. Whoops, excuse me. And let me go on to artists that were that came up there as well, because Celia's salon was really quite all-embracing. I mean, she had a very critical. She had a good nose for the right people, and she would invite the right people up to the hotel and put them in connect them with others. She was constantly mixing her court to a degree, and so some of the artists that she would invite up to Boston from Boston came up and were just as enraptured with the Isles of Shoals as Childe Hassam. And in fact, artists such as J. Appleton Brown, who had a considerable reputation in Boston, ended up building a studio and house on Appledore, as did another artist, Ross Turner. And Hassam built a small studio on Appledore. So they kept coming up, you know, they would come up every summer for a few weeks, sometimes several months. Hassam was sometimes there for more than a month, sometimes 2 months on Appledore. It was just an anchor to his calendar. It was something that became an important part of his routine, to the point where, you know, Hassam painted, it's estimated, 1/10 of his whole production. He's a very prolific artist, and 1/10 of his whole production of paintings, oils, watercolors, pastels, were done on the Isles of Shoals. J. Appleton Brown did many paintings and pastels out on Appledore. He was a close friend of Hassam's, roughly a contemporary. And you can see, moving from 1879, the painting of Celia's garden on the left, to 1890, is that he became increasingly under the sway of Impressionism, and probably through the influence of Childe Hassam. Ross Turner's the same way. He was a teacher of Celia's back in the 1870s, and she had coaxed him up. He found the whole place just completely enchanting, built a place there, and became a regular fixture in Celia's salons. And then a younger artist, Olaf Brauner, came up. He was Boston trained, and he came up to the Isles of Shoals in the last years of Celia's life, and became a regular visitor to the Isles of Shoals. And his work definitely shows the influence of Hassam, say, on the right, but also other artists like Frederick Waugh or even Winslow Homer on the left. You have to remember, Winslow Homer was just up the coast. Prout's Neck was just up the coast from Appledore. You could almost see it from there. And I cannot imagine two more opposite marine artists than Childe Hassam and Winslow Homer. But I would have loved to have been at a dinner table with them. Now, Hassam, just to sort of wrap this very brief talk up, one of the things that is most talked about when people who've been out to Appledore or to the Isles of Shoals, what they talk about are the sunsets, of looking across the Gulf of Maine to the New Hampshire coast. The sunsets are spectacular. I can certainly attest to that. And so people made a habit at the hotel after dinner, is that they would go out to the piazza or up to, there was a summer house along the path there that they could congregate at and watch the sunsets, which were often just, you know, mind-blowing. And Hassam seems to have caught on to that sort of ritual at the hotel, because he would take the cigar boxes, you know, the beveled tops, so those sliding bevel tops of wooden cigar boxes, Cuban cigar boxes. They were all over the island. You can imagine the men, you know, smoking them with brandy. But he would take the tops, and he would use them to paint on. And he would sit, probably quite ostentatiously, out on the porch or out on a rock with his paint kit. And he would very, very quickly paint the sunsets. People would gather around, and he would sell them for $100 or $150 a pop. Because he was out there, he was selling his pictures. He sold his paintings through Celia. She hung them in her studio. She hung a lot of artists' work in the studio, and they were for sale. Hassam was not averse to turning a quick buck. And these quick sketches had the double of benefit of just keeping his hand loose, his mind. You know, they were real challenges. How do you get a very, very quick lighting effect down onto in paint? And so these oil sketches are, I think, some of the most amazing works that Hassam ever did out on the shoals. But then he did one painting that is just stands out, like has always astonished me. Very close to the end of his time out there, in 1911, he painted this picture. He had just come back from Europe. He had seen some of the pointillists, Seurat, and other artists, Signac, and he started applying some of their paint techniques, these very quick, almost jots of color distributed over the whole surface, almost as a mosaic, to, I think, one of his most astonishing paintings. And this is taken, we don't know exactly where, but certainly from the shore of Appledore facing New Hampshire. But it's one of these really beautiful elegiac images of Appledore without Appledore being there. You know, it's all about Appledore, but the island is not evident. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is two paintings that Hassam did in the 1890s. Partly this is a painting that I bought for the North Carolina Museum of Art, and Hal and I found that it was probably painted in from Broad Cove, which is right in back of the hotel. It's a good, 2-minute walk from where Hassam would have been staying. He would have gotten up very early in the morning, maybe like 4 o'clock, and went down to the rocks, set up his easel, and painted the sun rising over the Atlantic. Absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous picture. And then we found in our research that he did this picture. And this is 1899. And it is a moonrise. It's in fact, it's titled on the back in Hassam's handwriting, Moonrise. So it's a full moon rising over the exact same spot. The tide is a little different. The tide is lower in the moonrise picture, but the moon and the sun are in the exact same spot. The horizon is in the same spot. He would have had to have had this paint. He would have had to have the painting on the left with him when he painted the painting on the right. That means the painting on the left was on Appledore. And I have this theory that some of my colleagues think is crazy, but I think he gave the painting on the left to Celia. He is known to have given paintings to Celia. It's the kind of painting she would have loved. She wrote about the sunset from Appledore. I think he gave that to Celia. And then what happens between 1890 and 1899 when he painted the moonrise is Celia dies. And she dies unexpectedly in 1894, just after the publication of An Island Garden. Hassam is one of the choreographers of her funeral. She's buried on the island just in back of the hotel. After Celia dies, Hassam doesn't come back to the island for 5 years. And then he comes back. His style has changed, but he paints this picture in the style of 1890. And he clearly sees this as a pendant to the one on the left. And I have to see, I see the painting on the right as his, it's a sort of a memorial picture to Celia and his friendship to Celia. The two of them really ought to be together, and I've tried to, my damnedest to convince the collector who owns it to leave it to North Carolina, and he's not helping me with that. But in any case, this is the only time Hassam painted a pendant like this, and I have to believe that the reason is his deep, deep affection for Celia Thaxter. So on that, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. That was wonderful. It's wonderful to kind of transport ourselves to the island right now. So everyone can please ask any questions you might like to in the Q&A box. Please type them in, and we have a few here. So first, Will Kilner, who you may have met.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah. One of our faculty. He asks, given how many street scenes and crowds he painted off island, especially in his early career, can you say more about not painting people on Appledore?
Well, that's an interest. Yeah, that's good. Because Hassam, and he's known for his paintings on the Isles of Shoals. He's also known for his paintings of flag draped streets, New York City, streets in Boston. When he moves to New York, he really becomes a sort of an urban impressionist. All the while, he is still roving around. He's quite peripatetic, and he'll go to Natick in Massachusetts. He went out west to Oregon. He is going to Europe, but Will is right. He paints a lot of crowds and a lot of people. I think what he found on Appledore is maybe solid or a refuge from all of that. Even though the island itself was quite crowded, he chose not to engage with that and instead to focus on Celia's garden and the immediate environs of Celia's garden. And then once she dies, that's when he ventures out into the wilder parts of the island. I think he sees it as his own recreation. It's a way of, why do people leave the city and they go to the country? People go to the city to be charged up and excited and overstimulated, and you go to the country or you go to this island to calm down and to focus and to enjoy serenity of sorts. And so I think that's that is the only explanation I can find of Hassam. Why Appledore and not another island? Why he didn't go to Mount Desert or any other island? I think it was Celia, and it was also convenient. That's the other thing I should mention. Appledore, for all of its remoteness, is actually quite convenient from Boston or New York. You just take the train to Portsmouth and you take the boat out to Appledore. It's not an arduous journey that you would have to have made if you went, say, farther down east for your scenery.
Excellent, thank you. So there's a couple questions related to this about, is there anything known about these artists who are associated with Appledore going to any of the other islands and painting in the Isles of Shoals, like Star, Smutty Nose, or Lunging? Have you seen anything from any of the other islands by these same painters?
Well, I mean, Hassam painted this whole series of the White Island Light watercolors. Those were among his first paintings that he did when he was when he was visiting in 1886. And you do get Hassam painting, what is it, the woman who was washed out to sea, the ledge that's on Star Island.
Yeah.
He paints that. He paints a tourist sitting in her location. You get occasionally, if the artists are based on Appledore, then they have to arrange for transportation to go to these other places. So it's less, and not just transportation, but they've got to carry all of their stuff. Mm-hmm. So it becomes less appealing.
I can see Childe being influenced by Celia to be interested in White Island,
Right.
as
Oh,
he
yeah.
is interested in the Norwegians on the south end of Appledore as well. So there
Right.
seems to be, maybe her showing him around.
I'm sure she did. And he really became one of the family. After she died, he would still go and have drinks with Oscar, and as I said, was still going out to the island 2 years after the hotel burned. He stopped probably because the outbreak of World War I made it difficult to go out. So 1916 is his last time out there.
And the hotel burned down in 1914.
14.
Yeah. So that must.
So he must have stayed in those houses that's
Yeah.
the Leighton house.
Yeah. My understanding is that he stayed in what was called Nickerson Cottage, which is today Founders
Right.
Cottage.
Yeah.
One question is, you spoke of the corrupted Yankee or British name that became Hassam. What was that? How do you spell that?
Howsam, Howsam, or Howsam, or sometimes Sum. It goes back to the 17th century and Puritans.
Okay, excellent, thank you. What did Childe do with his 5-year hiatus when Celia died?
Well, he was based in New York. He went to Europe again. He did other travels, but he just avoided the Isles of Shoals. I think it was grief as much as anything. And he finally made peace with it and came back in 1899. And, and that's where his whole approach to the island changes, because he doesn't paint Celia's garden. Most of it had pretty much gone to seed by that time, but he doesn't visit his old haunts. He moves outward, particularly the northeastern part of the island. It's where he finds most of his subjects. It's like getting away from Celia, anything that relates to Celia's world. He finds a different Appledore. It's almost like his own Appledore. Before that time, he was very much seeing the island through her eyes. I mean, she was always there. You can imagine she was looking over his shoulder in a lot of these cases.
Another question is, what's the contemporary view of Hassam's work as opposed to the great European Impressionists? Like, how does that fit into the Impressionistic world, which seems very European-centric?
Yeah, well, that's, when I was first in graduate school, American Impressionism was always looked down upon as they were like camp followers to the French. And, even artists like Hassam were always seen as derivative, and it was not seen as a particularly great moment in American art. That's changed. I think scholarship has caught up with it in seeing that there is something quite distinct about the way Americans interpreted the techniques of the French and combined them with native styles. I mean, you can look at a Hassam picture. Some of Hassam's paintings come perilously close to being French. They're almost indistinguishable. And in other cases, he pulls back and you can see him as being somewhat related to the Hudson River School in his approach to landscape. And, with Hassam's rock pictures, there is precedent in Monet, particularly at the cliffs in Normandy. But when you get down into the details, it's not. And Hassam is much more particular in his description than Monet is. Monet will be very general in massing in the rocks, and he's not really caring too terribly much about the geology. One of the things that we found in our research out on the island and comparing the paintings to the actual motif is how, in many instances, how amazingly faithful Hassam was to the geological reality of Appledore. And I don't think Monet wouldn't have had the patience for that. So there's something about in Hassam's work and a lot of American Impressionists that they stick more tightly to the observable reality. And I don't know, I'd have to think more on that, but it's.
I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this next question, but it is, what happened to all the amazing contents of Celia's parlor because as I've heard the story, when the hotel was burning, Oscar Layton actually was on Star and he saw the smoke, as did other people on Star, and he knew where he wanted to go first, and he got over to her house and was throwing things out the window of the parlor. And I've heard some rumors about some of the stuff, but do you know anything?
No, I really don't. I mean, I heard that story about Oscar. We don't know how. After Celia died, her house was kept something as a museum because she was so celebrated that people were still coming out and they wanted to see. And they tried to keep up her garden as best they could, but they really didn't have her special knack. But who knows how much her children took away.
Yeah.
You know, the art may have gone.
I have seen some of that art in circulation. As some of you know, Doug Nelson, who is an art collector of Isles of Shoals art, he has shown me some of that work from the salon in circulation out in the world.
Yeah, and I think that may have been taken by the kids. It could have been taken by Oscar at the end. I don't know. But 1914, that's 20 years after Celia's death. I don't know how much was left there.
It's a good question. Did Celia ever sketch or paint or write about Hassam? She definitely wrote about him.
She wrote about him. They didn't write it's odd, for such an obviously intense artistic relationship. I mean, there was never any romance or anything between them, but she was very much his muse on the island. For all of that, Hassam didn't write much of anything. He's really very annoying in his. He didn't write much. His letters are very short, not very informative. And Celia doesn't seem to write much about him. Maybe because he was always there.
She didn't have to write those long letters she wrote to John Greenleaf Whittier.
No. I mean, that was two poetic minds talking to one another. I don't think Hassam he was not a very gifted letter writer. Didn't enjoy it, so she probably didn't push him that much.
Yeah. There's a couple of final questions here that maybe you and I can answer collectively. First, did the Hassam cottage, well, it wasn't a cottage, Hassam studio burned down when the hotel did? And I know the answer to this, if you want to know. Everything on the north side of the island, which that was located on the north side, burned down when the hotel burned down.
Except for Cedric's house.
Correct, thank you. Cedric's house was like on that sort of, on the New Hampshire side of the island, and kind of a little bit. Yeah,
it was at the far end of the complex.
Right. So separated enough from the line of the fire because the wind was blowing from the south to the north. Yeah. And he stayed, when this person is asking about a cottage, he mostly stayed in Celia's house, this Nickerson cottage, or maybe the hotel. Those are the locations that I know about. Do you know of any more?
No, that's it. I don't think he stayed in the studio. The studio was really a workplace. He was out there with his wife, so he had to have some kind of comfort. If he wasn't staying with friends, he would stay in the hotel, and the hotel had, 3 square meals a day, probably 4, an open bar, lots of convivial company. Hassam was a very social animal. Their photos of him surrounded by women all the time. His studio, I think we found the foundations for it. It's difficult. It's amid all that poison ivy. Very close to it's very close to the cemetery. But it'd be interesting to kind of dig in there and actually find some confirmation, lead paint tubes or something like that.
Robin Hadlock-Seeley, who's very much interested in these topics, she also says that there was a night watchman hut that did not burn down at the north end of the island.
All right.
And the last question I have here is about the garden itself, kind of a mix of questions from a Cornell alum, wondering if she was the only person who cared for the garden during her time. And my impression is she was the primary gardener. She was definitely the master gardener of her own garden. And today we actually have a master gardener, Marie Nickerson, who I believe is on this call, who caretakes our garden now. And the garden now uses the same template that John showed earlier in the Island Garden book. And that is important because we wanted to be really true to the very specific heirloom variety plants that Celia used. Her garden was very intentional. It was a nod to a Victorian garden that her grandmother would have had. It's sort of an ode to her grandmother and was a working garden, as John has already pointed out. The cutting flowers for the hotel were the two sort of the function and the inspiration of the garden. So we caretake that garden today, and anyone actually can come out and see it. We give tours of the garden during the summer, and then we have public programs throughout the year, but especially towards the end of the summer, where we bring people out to see it. Remember, this is a working marine lab, so we like to kind of control how people see it, but we also want to tell you and show you all about it with a lot of experts. So I invite any of you who are interested in coming to see the garden and the place where John has talked about Childe Hassam's sort of inspiration. Any of you are welcome on any of those tours, hopefully, and I hope next summer that we'll be doing that. No guarantees on that right now, but that's our intention. So thank you all so much for those wonderful questions. John, thank you so much for answering them.
No,
excellent talk. We had a really wonderful number of attendees tonight, so that was great. Thank you all so much for joining us. Our next talk, as John alluded to, is Dr. Hal Weeks. He's a former Shoals assistant director. He was in that role from 2007 to 15, and he is an ongoing faculty member in an animal behavior class. And on top of all of that, he has a really deep interest in Childe Hassam, and is the whole reason why all of this interest and resurgence in the exhibition that John was telling you about came to be, was actually via Hal's interest in finding Childe Hassam sites on the island. You can actually stand in the very spot that Childe Hassam painted a painting there, and you know you are in that very spot. You step a foot to the right, a foot to the left, and you know you've stepped out of the shot, if you will. And he's going to talk about that next week. So we're looking forward to that. You can find out about all of these talks on our shoalsmarinelab.org website. And if you want to support us, you can make a donation there if you would like. Thank you so much for joining us. Everyone take care. Hope to see you here next week. Good night. Thank you so much, John. It was a real pleasure.
Take care.
Take care.